When an idea is so old and is so generally believed, it is probably true in some way. This is the basis of most of Carl Jung's ideas and investigations. The old and generally believed idea he begins with in Psychology of the Unconscious is that of dream interpretation and its importance. For thousands of years, people have given importance to their dreams. We can see this as early as the writing of Homer's Iliad, the Old Testament, and even in ancient Sumerian cuneiform. These people saw dreams as divine messages from the gods, and in many cases, these dreamers listened to the gods speak to them directly. To Jung, the truth in this generally held belief is that we are being spoken to and given messages, only that these messages aren't from externally existing gods, but from our own unconscious. When we dream, we are receiving images from our unconscious mind that have obscure and symbolic meaning. The unconscious speaks to us in this symbolic way in order to be obscure, in order to not be understood. Why would the unconscious give you messages that it doesn't want you to understand? It is due to the function of dreams and the existence of our self-judging morality. The purpose of dreams is wish fulfillment. Dreams can give the genuine feeling of having things we can't obtain in the real world, and therefore satisfy us. If this is the case, why would dreams not want to be understood? It is because many of our deepest and strongest desires are contrary to our morality and the image we want to have of ourselves. For instance, in Sigmund Freud's dream psychology, he describes a patient with the following dream. The patient sees her 15-year-old daughter dead and lying in a box. In reality, her daughter isn't dead, and the dreamer claims she doesn't want her to be either. Freud interprets her dream as wish fulfillment that the dreamer herself does not consciously understand. Box is a common term for vagina. The daughter still being in the vagina represents pregnancy. With this, the wish becomes much more clear. The mother wishes the daughter died while she was pregnant, so she would be free and not have the burdens and responsibilities of being a mother. Of course, it is morally repulsive to wish that one's own daughter never existed, especially after years of caring for her and creating a deep connection. To wish for the death of a close family member and a loved one in order to have a carefree life is something that would cause shame and guilt, at least at the time of the book's writing. Therefore, the unconscious satisfied the wish in a disguised way to not induce guilt or to provoke the bad conscious. All of this made Jung ask, how are dreams symbolic? This question made him investigate the process of thinking, and he concluded that we have two modes of thought, directed thinking and fantastic thinking. Directed thinking gets its name from the fact that this mode of thought is directed in a linear way. Each thought builds on the previous one in a logical manner. This is the type of thinking we do when considering a difficult problem in our heads. It takes effort, can be exhausting, and is always a completely conscious form of thought. Think of this. Perhaps you're at a crossroads in your life. You need to decide between accepting one of two jobs. One job pays more, it's work you don't enjoy. You have to move to a part of the country you like, and it's far away from your family. The other job pays less, it's work you enjoy very much. You wouldn't have to move, and it's close to your family. Either choice you make will have a big impact on your life, so you must consider carefully what's best for you. You weigh the pros and cons carefully. Work is half of my waking day. How important is it to me that I enjoy such a substantial portion of my life? What can I do with the extra money that I couldn't do otherwise? Is it worth not doing what I enjoy? How much will moving improve my life? Do I want to move away from my family so I can publicly do blow-off hookers without familial shame? You notice that you're thinking in words. As Jung says, a very intensive train of thinking works itself out more or less in word form. That is, if anyone wants to express it, teach it, or convince anyone of it. Evidently, it directs itself wholly to the outside world. To this extent, the directed or logical thinking, having a real existence for us, that is to say, a thinking that adjusts itself to actual conditions, where we expressed in other words, imitate the succession of objectively real things, so that the images of our mind follow after each other in the same strictly casual succession as historical events outside of our mind. All of that is to say, word thought is always based on objective reality. This is due to the nature of words. I can point at a tree and call it a tree. If someone points at the tree and also calls it a tree, then we have the same word for an objective, real-world thing. I can do the same with color, but I cannot do this with the mental image I have of the color. The red that you see is a completely subjective internal phenomena. There is no way to point at it, and consequently, no way to describe it with words. We can therefore say Words and directed thought only address external reality, and even then, only with the purpose of communicating it with others. The other kind of thought is fantasy thinking. While directed thinking creates innovations, adaptations, imitates reality, and seeks to act upon it, fantasy thinking, on the contrary, turns away from reality, sets subjective wishes, and is, in regard to adaptations, wholly unproductive. Unlike directed thinking, which requires focus and conscious effort, fantasy thought won't make you tired. In fact, it's a default mental state. When you no longer concentrate on a particular thought and simply let your mind relax and wander, it begins to fantasize. This fantasy thought is the source of dreams and the mythological mindset of our ancestors. The focus on directed thinking our culture has is actually a very modern thing. We put all of our energy into stripping away the subjective view of reality to create a purely objective view of reality. Ancient people were just the opposite. Their culture had a much stronger emphasis on fantastic or mythological thinking rather than directed thinking. I saw a video by a YouTuber named Holdenstone that asks, were the Romans close to an industrial revolution? Certainly, they had the technology and the economic resources for it, but Holdenstone goes over the economic and social pressures that prevented Rome from achieving the Industrial Revolution nearly 2,000 years early. I find it very interesting that Carl Jung had the same question and answered it with psychoanalysis. Inquisitive minds have often tormented themselves with the question why the undoubtedly extraordinary knowledge of mathematics and principles and material facts, united with the unexampled art of the human hand in antiquity, never arrive at the point of developing those technical statements of fact, for instance, the principle of simple machines, beyond the realm of the amusing and curious, to a real technic in the modern sense. There is necessarily only one answer to this. The ancients almost entirely, with the exception of a few extraordinary minds, lack the capacity to allow their interests to follow the transformation of inanimate matter to the extent necessary for them to be able to reproduce the process of nature, creatively, and through their own art, by means of which alone they could have succeeded in putting themselves in the possession of the force of nature. That which they lacked was training in directed thinking, or, to express it psychoanalytically, the ancients did not succeed in tearing loose the libido which might be sublimated from other natural relations, and did not turn voluntarily to anthropomorphism. The secret of the development of culture lies in the mobility of the libido, and its capacity for transference. It is therefore to be assumed that the directed thinking of our time is more or less a modern acquisition, which was lacking in earlier times. Sublimation and the libido are key ideas that are fleshed out later in the book, but all of this is to say, ancient people were too focused on the baser desires that are stronger parts of the subjective human experience than in the objective, disinterested knowledge, and by that I mean that ancient people would rather eat, have sex, and dominate other men than observe the facts of reality that don't affect them. Even the intellectuals and philosophers of the age were focused on how reality affects people, rather than having detached knowledge about reality itself. As we can see, modern directed thinking looks outward into reality in a detached way to see how reality works, whereas ancient thinking, which was heavily fantastic, focused inward and only cared about reality as it was subjectively experienced. So what's Jung getting at here? That ancient people are dumb brain cucks and modern men are superior turbo-brain gigachads? No. Modern and ancient people are physiologically the same, and while modern thought has a greater focus on directed thinking, fantasy thinking is still a part of our psychology. The mental energy we put into technology, invention, and industrialization, ancient men put into mythology and rituals. To Jung, studying the myths and thoughts of the past is key to understanding the part of the mind modern people have lost touch with. Ancient people had a view of the world that was divorced from objective reality because of their fantastic mode of thought. Is there any way modern man can experience this? Yes. Children, and dreams especially, use fantastic thinking more than directed thinking. Children, much like ancient men, come up with stories about the world and project their subjective fantasies onto reality. To the ancients, the sun and moon aren't celestial bodies floating in space. They are a father and a mother watching over us. For children, it's a common belief to think that all dogs are boys and all cats are girls. Dreams also have a similar mode of thought. That is, they are unconcerned with reality. Not only do dreams use fantasy thinking, but the process of the experience in dreams is exactly the opposite of waking thought. While awake, thoughts are characterized by progression. There is a perception, the conscious or unconscious mind thinks about how to react to the perception, then an action is executed. Dreams, on the other hand, are characterized by regression. This begins in the preconscious or unconscious mind and turns into a perception. The perceptions the unconscious creates comes from memories. As the dream continues through regression, the dream will regress into childhood memories. Since dreams do not wish to be understood, those memories will represent themselves with more recent impressions. Freud believes that dreams are a piece of the conquered life of the childish soul. The dream, which fulfills its wishes by a short regressive path, affords us only an example of the primary method of working of the psychic apparatus, which has been abandoned to us as unsuitable. That which once ruled over the waking state, when the psychic life was still young and impotent, appears to be banished to the dream life, somewhat in the same way as the bow and arrow, those discarded primitive weapons of adult humanity, which have been relegated to the nursery. So we can see that fantasy thinking is a common link between ancient men, children, and dreams. But what is the driving force behind fantasies? Just like in dreams, the function of all fantasy thinking is wish fulfillment. Our mind gives us things in our fantasy that we want in the real world but cannot get. We choose as an example a typical fantasy of puberty. A child in that stage before whom the whole frightening uncertainty of the future fate opens, puts back the uncertainty into the past through his fantasy and says, "If only I were not a child of my ordinary parents, but the child of a rich and fashionable count, who had been merely passed over to my parents, then some day a golden coach would come, and the count would take back his child with him to his wonderful castle." And so it goes on, as in Grimm's fairy tales, which the mother tells to her children. With a normal child, it stops with a fugitive, quickly passing idea, which is soon covered over and forgotten. However, at one time, and that was in the ancient world of culture, the fantasy was an openly acknowledged institution. The heroes, I recall Romulus and Remus, Semiramis, Moses, and many others, have been separated from their real parents. Others are directly sons of gods, and noble races derive their family trees from heroes and gods. As one sees by this example, the fantasy of modern humanity is nothing but a re-echo of an old folk belief which was very widespread originally. These wishes we have do not care how the real world works, unlike our directed linguistic thought that only cares how the real world works. This can cause a separation between our subconscious and unconscious desires and our conscious ideas of what we should desire. For instance, ice cream is very delicious and high in nutrients your body is designed to crave, such as sugars and fats. You may have a desire to eat only ice cream all the time, every day. Your conscious linguistic mind will tell you that eating only ice cream will lead to feeling bad and becoming fat and unhealthy. Therefore, you shouldn't eat so much ice cream. You shouldn't want to eat so much ice cream because of what it will do to you. Your unconscious is not concerned with reality and its consequences. It likes ice cream and therefore makes you desire to eat more of it than is good for you. Because of this, we have fantasies that we may consider bad or even evil. We see widespread and acceptable practices and rituals in the ancient world that we would detest as extremely immoral, but the ancients saw as a normal part of life. Sodomy with young boys, raping the women of defeated towns and villages, even bestiality. We must remember that our linguistic thinking changes and adapts over generations much faster than our physiology. So while we have outgrown certain actions and behaviors, we should still recognize and study these things. While we shouldn't deny the existence of this part of our mind, we shouldn't completely give in to it either. Rejecting these thoughts completely is repression. This leads to mental issues in which you have desires you are ashamed to even admit exist inside yourself. You therefore have wishes that have no hope of being fulfilled. You will long for something you can't even identify. On the other hand, giving in to fantastic thinking will lead to what Jung calls the infantile mind. If you give in to fantastic thinking completely without any correction from linguistic adaptive thinking, you will create an extremely distorted view of the world based on how you want it to be, rather than how it is. The solution Jung has for these destructive desires is to redirect psychic energy, also known as libido, into more constructive pursuits. Doing this will fulfill the desire in a way suitable to the real world. This process is called sublimation. Jung addresses and elaborates on this in a later chapter of the book, Conception and Theory of the Libido. Now that we have an idea of what fantasy thinking is, Jung goes on to say that fantasy thinking is the key in understanding the different layers of our mind. Our mind has layers, and like an archaeological site, the deepest layer is the oldest, the unconscious. The highest layer in our mind is conscious thinking. In this layer, fantasies manifest themselves as daydreams. We consciously think of ourselves in certain situations and picture how things would be. In non-lucid dreams, we cannot control the course of our dreams, and their obscure meaning can only be understood through analysis. And on the deepest level, there is a completely unconscious fantasy system in the split-off complex. The split-off complex being desires, emotion, and other phenomena in our psyche that we do not consciously notice. We do not identify our ego personality with this part of the mind, or as Jung puts it, this system exhibits a pronounced tendency towards the production of a dissociated personality. Because of this layered structure, when someone starts focusing their energy on the internal world instead of the external world, this is known as introversion, they will begin to reminisce on their past, the deeper and older layers of the mind. The more one goes into introversion, the more infantile their mind will become. It seems to me that when Jung talks about these older parts of the mind, he's talking both anthropologically and personally. Archaic men were dominated by these unconscious fantastic parts of the psyche. But so too are children. When he talks about returning to these older parts of the mind, he's talking about a personal return to our personal past. Jung ends the chapter with a story about the deeper layers of thought rising to the conscious surface. The fantasy from the deep presents itself to the protagonist in an indirect way, so the protagonist can address his issues without consciously doing anything immoral. A priest named Abbe Oeger began to reflect on and worry about the fate of Judas, that famous friend of Jesus who betrayed him. Oeger believed that Judas was an instrument of God, and he helped Christ redeem humanity. Jesus' self-sacrifice on the cross is a key part, perhaps the key part, of Christian theology. His sacrifice is what washes away the sins of humanity, so it's good that Christ was crucified. It needed to happen. Judas was a part of the redemption of mankind. Oeger reasoned from this that an all-good God could not have damned Judas to hell. Oeger prayed for a sign that Judas was saved, and he felt a heavenly touch on his shoulder. With this, he was satisfied that Judas was saved. Sometime after this event, Oeger left the Roman Catholic Church to become a Swedenborgian. This denominational switch makes it clear to Jung what the previous fantasy was about. Oeger identified himself with Judas, and wanted to betray the Church, which is a symbol of Christ in Oeger's fantasy and in society generally. Since Oeger was a genuinely pious man, he projected his own desire for betrayal onto a well-known betrayer, then made sure that Judas was saved and went to heaven before committing his own betrayal. This story highlights the fact that we cannot take fantasy thoughts as literal events or desires. They are symbols that speak in indirect ways. Conscious fantasies tell us of mythical or other material of undeveloped or no longer recognized wish tendencies in the soul. They concern the tendencies which are considered immoral and generally impossible, and the strongest resentment is felt towards bringing them into the consciousness. That concludes the first chapter of Psychology of the Unconscious, concerning two kinds of thinking. We learned that the two kinds of thinking are directed linguistic thought, which concerns itself with the objective external world, and fantastic thought, which concerns itself with our own desires and subjective experience. Fantasy thought is created and driven by wish fulfillment. The unconscious makes fantasies unclear to the conscious mind so that we can accept them without moral indignation. When fantasies aren't corrected by directed thinking and objective observation, an untrue view of the world will be developed. This incorrect view is based on our own desires and how we wish the world to be. Jung identifies these skewed views of reality as the infantile mind. Myths and religions come from fantasy thinking and represent the symbols of the unconscious for entire populations and cultures. I plan on going over the whole book, so if this video interested you, subscribe.